The requisition form smelled of iron and old ink when they pressed it into my hands, and I knew before reading it that my name had been written in the wrong ledger. The cold of the administratum hall seeped through my boots, permafrost concrete that had never known warmth in 300 years of Imperial service, each molecule of moisture frozen into the structure so deeply that the floors rang like bell metal when the morning shift arrived. My supervisor's breath formed crystals as she spoke the words that separated my old life from what came after. Report to Sub-Level 93, Ecclesiastical Annex, Division of Sacred Labor, congratulations. Her lips were blue at the edges. Everyone's lips were blue at the edges in the administratum. We told ourselves it was the cold, not the slow oxygen deprivation that came from working in a sealed environment 3 kilometers below the hive surface. No one congratulated the chosen. I was nobody. A data scribe 14th class, assigned to agricultural tithe verification in Hive Secundus, Processing Tower 7, Subsector Epsilon Grave. I had no family, orphaned in the lower collapse of 87 when a support column failed and took 4 residential blocks into the dark, raised in the Schola service with 10,000 other grey children who learned to read so the Imperium's numbers would always align. I had no friends, only colleagues whose names I had memorized because the work required coordination but whose faces blurred together in my memory like smudged ink. I had no lovers, no debts beyond the standard labor obligation, no patrons in the upper hive, no enemies worth the name or the expense of maintaining a grudge. My efficiency rating was adequate, never excellent, never poor, always hovering in that comfortable middle percentile where scrutiny rarely reached. My devotional attendance was regular, logged by retinal scan at the district chapel every 7th day without fail. My biometric file showed no abnormalities, no unauthorized augmentation, no genetic flags that would mark me for specialized service or immediate termination. I was a number that fit neatly in the margins, and that made me perfect for what they needed. The descent took 4 hours. The lift was unpowered, a manual crank system that groaned with each level, operated by a servitor whose original face had worn away to polished bone under centuries of touch, the friction of 10,000 hands on the same skull leaving it smooth as glass. I counted the floors by the changing smells, promethium exhaust at 50, where the generator complexes labored without rest, recycled corpse starch at 60, the rendering facilities that processed the hive's dead into tomorrow's rations, something sweet and rotten at 70 that I could not identify and did not want to, and then nothing at all past 80. The absence of scent was worse than any stench. It meant the air was too old to carry anything organic, too still to circulate, too close to whatever lay beneath the hive's inhabited shell. I tried to make conversation with the servitor, an old habit from my years in the upper levels, but it responded only with a clicking sound that might have been broken Vox machinery or the remnants of a tongue striking against teeth worn to nubs. Sub-level 93 was silent in a way that made my ears ring. The ecclesiastical annex was not a chapel or scriptorium but a processing facility, vast and dimly lit by lumens that flickered with the pulse of some distant generator, a rhythm that was almost but not quite regular, creating a subliminal sense of wrongness that burrowed into the back of my skull. The walls were not metal or stone but something that looked grown, ribbed, pale, faintly translucent where the light caught wrong, revealing shadows that might have been structural supports or something older, something that predated the hive's construction. I thought of cave systems, of digestive tracts, of the interior spaces of things not meant to be entered. Rows of workstations stretched into shadow, easily 500 desks arranged in perfect lines, each occupied by a figure hunched over parchment or data slate, each working in absolute silence. No one looked up when I entered. No one acknowledged my presence except the proctor, a tall man in robes the color of dried blood, whose eyes were clouded white with cataracts but tracked my movement with unnerving precision, following me from the lift entrance to the processing desk without ever appearing to move his head. "Scribe Tertius 7-9 Kappa," he said, reading from no document I could see, his voice a dry whisper that somehow carried perfectly in the dead air. "Your assignment, verification and cataloging of penitential records subsector grave. You will process 300 files per shift. You will not speak. You will not leave your station except during sanctioned relief periods, which will be announced by bell. You will not question the content of the records. You will not retain memory of the content of the records beyond what is necessary for accurate cataloging. You will not discuss your work with other scribes. You will not remove any materials from this facility. Failure to meet quotas results in reassignment to primary labor. Secondary failure results in processing. Do you understand?" I understood that I had no choice. The requisition form was already signed, countersigned, and filed in triplicate. My old position had already been filled. I had seen the new scribe, a young woman with the same hunched shoulders and resigned expression, sitting at my desk when I collected my personal effects. I said the words required. "I serve the God Emperor's will in all things, now and forever, unto the ending of the stars." The proctor handed me a data slate, its screen cracked and yellowed with age, the plasteel casing worn smooth by countless hands, and gestured to a workstation in the third row, 17th position. The chair was cold, metal without padding, designed for function rather than comfort. The desk was bare except for a small votive candle that burned with a blue flame, odorless and unwavering, casting no heat that I could detect even when I held my hand directly above it. I activated the slate and the first file opened, a penitent's confession, recorded in spidery handscript that wavered between languages, Low Gothic, technical cant, something older I did not recognize but that made my eyes water when I tried to focus on the characters. The subject had been convicted of ideological contamination 3rd degree. The confession detailed his crime. He had questioned the necessity of a tithe increase that starved his district, not publicly but in a private conversation with his spouse, who had reported him after the mandatory devotional instruction on familial duty. He had spoken his doubt aloud to 4 witnesses during the subsequent investigation. The witnesses had testified against him. He had been sentenced to labor reclamation. The file included an image, his face before processing, gaunt and exhausted but recognizably human, and after, when the lobotomy scars had healed into smooth divots at his temples and his eyes had taken on the fixed, glazed quality of the servitor operating the lift. I logged the file. I moved to the next. The silence was total, oppressive, a physical presence that pressed against my eardrums and made me aware of sounds I had never noticed before. The wet click of my throat when I swallowed, the faint whisper of blood moving through the veins in my temples, the occasional creak of my spine when I shifted position. I could hear my heartbeat, the faint hum of the data slate, the scratch of styluses on parchment from the workers around me. No one coughed. No one shifted. No one made any sound that would indicate the presence of living humans rather than some clockwork mechanism designed to mimic life. The cold settled into my bones, working its way past skin and muscle until it felt like my marrow itself had frozen, and I realized I could not remember the last time I had felt warm, not comfortable, not merely not cold, but genuinely warm. Hours passed, or perhaps minutes. Time became elastic in that place, unmoored from any external measure. There were no clocks, no bells, no shifts of light or shadow to mark the progression of day into night. I processed files, a woman who had wept during a mandatory execution, displaying emotional attachment to a convicted heretic, a child who had drawn heretical symbols in dust, though the symbols were revealed to be nothing more than common pictograms taught in basic education, a veteran who had flinched during prayer, his trauma from 40 years of frontline service recorded as evidence of spiritual corruption rather than psychological damage. Each file ended the same way: reassignment to sacred labor, lobotomy, execution by various means both efficient and prolonged, or disappearance into categories labeled only with alphanumeric strings that I was not cleared to understand. I began to notice patterns in the strings. Certain combinations appeared frequently, others rarely, some never repeated. I wondered what they meant, what bureaucratic machinery they fed into, but the proctor's warnings echoed in my mind and I did not ask. At the 200th file, I noticed the larger pattern. Every penitent was unremarkable. Every crime was minor. Doubts whispered behind closed doors, gestures misinterpreted by zealous observers, failures of enthusiasm during devotionals, delays in response to official inquiries. None had committed violence against imperial citizens. None had engaged in organized resistance. None had possessed forbidden materials or engaged in proscribed practices. They were the forgettable, the isolated, the bereaved, the exhausted laborers whose value had declined below the cost of their maintenance, the elderly whose productivity no longer justified their ration allocation, the injured whose recovery time exceeded the expense of replacement. They were chosen not because they were dangerous, but because they were convenient, because no one would miss them, because their disappearance would create no ripples in the vast ocean of imperial bureaucracy, no inquiries from concerned relatives or outraged patrons, no complications that would require additional paperwork or explanations. I looked up from the slate and saw the other workers clearly for the first time. Their hands moved in perfect rhythm, synchronized to a tempo I could not hear but could feel in the air like a subsonic vibration. Their heads never turned, their postures never varied. Beneath the hoods and shabby robes that marked them as ecclesiastical labor, I glimpsed the telltale shine of augmetic implants, cheap, mass-produced models that left visible scarring and surgical mesh. The slack faces of those who had been processed and returned to labor, their personalities reduced to the minimum required to perform simple cataloging tasks. I was not working alongside scribes. I was working alongside the catalogued, the processed, the disappeared, who had been returned to function in the same facility where their fates had been decided. The proctor appeared at my shoulder without sound, without footsteps or warning or any indication of approach. His breath smelled of formaldehyde and something sweeter, like incense that had been burning for so long it had caramelized. "Quota incomplete," he said. "Resume work." I resumed. I had no other choice. The data slate tracked my progress automatically, updating some distant file that bore my name and designation. To refuse was to accept immediate processing. To comply was to accept eventual processing. The mathematics was simple and brutal, the shifts blurred. I lost track of days. There were no windows, no clocks, no change in the dim lighting that flickered with that irregular rhythm that made my head ache. I was given rations twice per cycle, a grey paste dispensed from a wall-mounted unit that tasted of nothing and left me neither hungry nor sated, existing in a strange state of perpetual almost satisfaction that was more disturbing than genuine hunger would have been. I was permitted one rest period per cycle, spent in a narrow cell with a cot and a single devotional text whose pages had been read to translucence by countless previous occupants, the words worn away in places so that the prayers became surreal, fragmented things that spoke of duty and sacrifice, and the God-Emperor's love in disconnected phrases. I dreamed of numbers, endless columns that scrolled past my vision faster than I could read them, and of faces that dissolved into static when I tried to focus on their features. I woke each time unsure if I had slept or merely stopped moving. The line between consciousness and unconsciousness eroded until I existed in a perpetual twilight state. The files grew worse. I processed a penitent who had been convicted of hoarding food, 3 ration bars hidden in her quarters, saved for a child who had died weeks earlier from malnutrition, but whose death had not yet been officially recorded, creating a temporary window of double ration eligibility that she had exploited. I processed a man whose crime was crying out during an industrial accident, disrupting the sacred rhythm of labor with his screams as a hydraulic press crushed his hand. I processed an entire family, parents and 3 children, executed for the crime of one member's unspoken doubt. The father had hesitated for 3 seconds before responding to a loyalty oath, a delay noted by a monitoring servitor and flagged for investigation. The images grew more detailed with each file, faces before, faces after, bodies rendered into components for recycling, organs catalogued for transplant or experimental use, skeletons ground for nutrient paste that would be fed back into the hive's food supply. The Imperium wasted nothing. Every gram of flesh, every milliliter of fluid, every shard of bone was accounted for and repurposed. Even the hair was collected, woven into industrial filters or insulation material. I began to see my own face in the files. Not literally, my designation had not yet appeared in the penitential records, but in the shape of the penitents' lives. Orphans, low-level functionaries, the unremarkable, those who fit neatly into margins, those whose lives were documented thoroughly enough to be monitored, but not thoroughly enough to be valued. I had believed my obscurity was safety, that by demanding nothing and offering steady service I would be overlooked, would slip between the cracks of the Imperium's vast attention. I had not understood that obscurity was not a crack to hide in, but a flag, a marker that made me useful precisely because my disappearance would require no explanation. The Imperium did not need my consent. It needed my absence to be unmourned, unremarked, unnoticed. On what I believed was the 14th shift, I had been counting by rest periods, scratching marks into the metal frame of my cot with a bent stylus I had smuggled from the work floor. The proctor brought me a different slate. "Special assignment," he said, his white eyes fixed on some point past my shoulder. "Verification of processing outcome. Subsector grave. Recent intake. Priority review." The file opened to my own face. The image was dated 3 days prior, the day I had descended in the manual lift, counting floors by smell. My designation was listed correctly: Scribe Tertius 7-9 Kappa, Agricultural Tithe Verification, Hive Secundus, Processing Tower 7. My crime was labeled as Suspected Ideological Contamination, Evidence Pending Review. The confession section was blank, awaiting input. The witness testimony section was blank. The evidence summary contained a single line: subject demonstrates profile consistent with ideological vulnerability, low social integration, no family attachments, adequate but unexceptional performance metrics, recommended for preventive processing. The sentencing field was pre-filled: reassignment to sacred labor, Sublevel 93 Ecclesiastical Annex, with scheduled processing upon quota completion. Estimated processing date, 14 shifts from intake. Today. I looked up. The proctor was watching me with those cataract white eyes that saw everything, that had seen this same realization cross countless faces before mine. "Quota complete," he said. "Report to Medicae Station for processing. Your service has been noted. The God Emperor values your sacrifice." I stood. My legs shook but carried me. The other workers did not look up. They had learned not to look up, or had been processed until the impulse to look up no longer existed. I walked between the rows of stations, past the hunched figures whose faces I could now see clearly. Slack, scarred, empty of everything but the minimum function required to move a stylus across parchment. I recognized some of them from the files I had processed. their before images matching imperfectly with the after images that now sat hunched over desks, cataloging their own kind. I reached the Medicae station, a small room separated from the main hall by a curtain of heavy plastic sheeting that was stained with old blood and other fluids I did not want to identify. Inside was a single chair, reclined like a throne or an execution bench, and a tech priest whose augmentations had replaced so much flesh that I could not determine what they had been before. Man or woman, young or old, even their original species was ambiguous beneath the layers of steel and ceramic and bundled cables. "Sit," the tech priest said, voice rendered flat by the Vox grill embedded in their throat, flanged and emotionless. I sat. The restraints closed automatically, soft but unyielding, some kind of memory foam material that conformed to my limbs and then hardened into immobility. The tech priest moved with mechanical precision, arranging instruments on a tray, drills, clamps, injection units, devices I had no names for that gleamed with the dull shine of frequently sterilized steel. The air smelled of disinfectant and heated metal, and something organic that had been burned away. I thought of the files I had processed, the before and after images, the efficiency of the procedure. I thought of my life, the long years of believing I served the Imperium, that my labor mattered, that my obscurity was a kind of freedom rather than a sentence waiting to be executed. "Wait," I said. My voice was hoarse from weeks of silence, cracking on the single syllable. "I have not committed any crime. There is no evidence, no confession, no witnesses. I have served faithfully for 23 years. My efficiency ratings are adequate. My devotional attendance is perfect. I have never questioned, I have never doubted. There must be some mistake." The tech priest paused, cocking their head with the curious gesture of something that had forgotten the meaning of curiosity but retained the mechanical habit of the motion. They examined me with optical implants that whirred as they focused, lenses clicking into place. "Irrelevant," they said finally. "You were chosen because no one would miss you. This is the evidence. The absence of connection is the crime. The Imperium requires workers. The Imperium requires sacrifice. You are both. Your service is valued. Your processing is necessary. The God Emperor smiles upon those who give everything." I opened my mouth to argue, to plead, to invoke the rights of an imperial citizen, the protection supposedly granted to loyal servants, the procedures that were meant to ensure justice, but the words dissolved before I could form them. I knew the truth. There were no rights, only permissions that could be revoked without explanation or appeal. There was no justice, only efficiency. There were no protections, only the temporary blindness of a bureaucracy that had not yet turned its attention to you. I had processed 3,000 files that proved it. The Imperium did not require justice, only function. I was a number, and numbers could be reassigned, recalculated, zeroed out when they became inconvenient or when their value fell below the cost of maintaining them in the ledger. The tech priest activated the first instrument. I heard the whine of a drill powering up, felt the cold touch of a clamp against my temple, positioned with precision over the spot where the lobotomy would sever the connections that made me who I was. I thought of my supervisor, who had handed me the requisition form without meeting my eyes, who had perhaps done this same thing 100 times before, processed 100 unremarkable scribes into the machinery below. I thought of the 10,000 grey children I had grown beside in the Schola service, whose names I could not recall, whose faces had blurred together because we had been taught not to form attachments, not to become memorable, to be interchangeable parts in the vast machine. I thought of every moment I had believed myself safe because I was small, because I was quiet, because I was unremarkable, never understanding that those very qualities were what marked me for this fate. The drill touched my skull, and I felt the first bright flare of pain before the anesthetic took hold, flooding my system with chemical numbness that did not quite reach the core of terror in my chest. I woke in the third row, 17th position, at my workstation. The data slate was in my hands. A file was open. A penitent convicted of suspected ideological contamination, recent intake, scheduled for processing. The image showed my own face before. I logged the file. I moved to the next. The silence was total. I could hear my heartbeat, the faint hum of the data slate, the scratch of styluses on parchment from the workers around me. No one looked up. No one acknowledged my presence. The cold settled into my bones, and I realized I could not remember the last time I had felt warm. My hands moved in perfect rhythm. My head did not turn. Beneath the surface of my thoughts, something that had once been me screamed, but the sound did not reach my throat, trapped behind whatever neural pathways had been severed during processing. I was aware. That was the horror of it. I was aware that I had been processed, aware that I was cataloging my own transformation, aware that my hands moved without my will, that my eyes tracked the text without my desire to read it. The lobotomy had not destroyed consciousness but isolated it, leaving me a passenger in my own flesh. The proctor walked between the rows, observing, recording on a data slate of his own. He stopped at my station and placed a hand on my shoulder. His touch was cold even through the fabric of my robe. Efficient, he said. Exemplary service. The God Emperor is pleased. His white eyes did not blink. I wondered if he had ever been processed himself, if he was aware inside his own skull, or if he had been born into this role and knew nothing else. I continued working. I would continue working until my body failed, and then they would recycle what remained and bring in another who had been chosen because no one would miss them. The Imperium was efficient. The Imperium wasted nothing. I processed the next file, and the next, and the next, each one a mirror of the same truth. We were all chosen long before we understood what choice meant. We were chosen in the orphanages, in the Shola, in the assignments that moved us like game pieces across the board of the Imperium's vast territories. We were chosen by our loneliness, our competence that was never quite excellence, our obedience that was never quite zeal. We were the raw material, the expendable mass that fueled a machine that had been grinding for 10,000 years and would grind for 10,000 more. Somewhere far above, in the inhabited levels of the hive, another scribe received a requisition form. It smelled of iron and old ink. Their supervisor's breath formed crystals as she spoke the words that separated their old life from what came after. They would believe themselves unlucky, or perhaps secretly honored, to be chosen for sacred labor. They would descend, counting the floors by changing smells, promethium, corpse starch, something sweet and rotten, then nothing at all. They would arrive in the silence of sub-level 93, where the walls looked grown, and the workers never looked up, and they would sit at a station and begin processing files, never understanding that they were processing the documentation of their own future until it was too late. They would sit, they would process files, they would see the pattern, and they would understand too late. No one would miss them. The blue flame of the votive candle burned without wavering, odorless and eternal, casting no shadow across the rows of bent figures who had once believed their obscurity was safety. I was one of them now, a number in the margin, a function without memory, or rather with memory but without the ability to act on it, trapped in a body that obeyed commands I did not give. My hands moved. The files scrolled. The quota never ended. 300 files per shift, every shift forever, until my body wore out and was rendered down into components. I do not remember my name. That is a lie. I remember my name. I remember everything. That is the punishment. The lobotomy did not erase memory but severed the connections between thought and action, between desire and behavior, between the self that observes and the body that functions. I am screaming inside my own skull, have been screaming for what might be days or years or decades, and no one hears. No one can hear. The other workers are screaming too, I understand now, trapped in their own skulls, processing files and cataloging the disappeared, while their inner selves rage and weep and beg for death. I remember only the cold, the silence, and the smell of iron and old ink on the requisition form that chose me because I could be lost without consequence. The Imperium is vast. The Imperium is eternal. The Imperium requires workers who will not be mourned. I am one of those workers. I am the worker I catalogued in 3,000 files, the unremarkable one. The one whose crime was not heresy but convenience. I serve. I have always served. I will serve until there is nothing left to serve with, and then I will serve still, because the alternative was never real. The requisition form had already been signed. The descent had already begun. The choice was made centuries before I was born, in the ledgers that calculated the value of a human life and found it less than the cost of asking permission, less than the expense of justifying a decision, less than the minor inconvenience of leaving a position unfilled. The proctor moves through the rows. His white eyes see everything. He is looking for signs of quota failure, of hesitation, of the faint ember of resistance that would require correction, not punishment, because punishment implies transgression, but correction, because we are machines that have developed faults. I do not hesitate. I do not resist. The body I inhabit does not allow it. I process the files, 300 per shift, each one a small death catalogued and filed, each one a reminder that mercy is not a function the Imperium has been programmed to perform. In the file before me, a penitent's final words are recorded. I thought if I stayed quiet, they would forget I existed. I log the file. I move to the next. They did not forget. They never forget. They were counting on the quiet ones, the unremarkable ones, the ones who believed invisibility was protection. We were the raw material of empire, the expendable mass that fueled the machine. We were chosen not despite our insignificance, but because of it. The Imperium does not waste effort hunting down the truly dangerous. Those require specialized teams, resources, time. Instead, it harvests the convenient, the isolated, the ones whose disappearance creates no complications. It is efficient, it is sustainable, it is monstrous in its banality. I understand now, in the small space of consciousness that remains behind the lobotomy scars, trapped like an insect in amber. I understand that every penitent in every file I processed understood it too, in their final moments, when the drill touched their temple and the truth became inescapable, when they felt the anesthetic flooding their system and knew that they would wake up as something less than they were. We were all complicit in our own erasure, believing that service would save us, that obedience would matter, that the Imperium valued loyalty more than it valued efficiency. The Imperium values only function. I am functioning. I will continue to function until I am processed into the next form of service, nutrient paste to feed the next generation of workers, organ grafts to extend the lives of more valuable citizens, recycled components for the servitors who operate the lifts and process the dead and maintain the endless machinery of the hive. I will be used completely, efficiently, without waste. And when I am gone, another will descend, another who smells the iron and old ink, another who believes themselves chosen for something other than convenient disappearance. The cycle is perfect, the cycle is eternal. The cold settles deeper, working its way past bone into whatever core of selfhood remains. My hands move without instruction, driven by neural pathways that bypass the conscious mind. The files scroll endlessly, a catalogue of the disappeared, and I am both scribe and subject, both witness and evidence. The blue flame burns without heat. The proctor watches without sympathy. The silence holds us all in its grip, and we do not scream because we no longer remember how, or we remember but cannot force the sound past lips that no longer obey us. Somewhere above, a requisition form is being printed. A name is being written in the wrong ledger. A supervisor's breath is forming crystals in the cold air of an administratum hall. The descent is beginning again, as it always begins, as it will always begin, Because the Imperium is vast and the Imperium requires workers, and some of us were always going to be chosen because no one would miss us. I am not missed. I was never here. The files confirm it. My own file, which I processed after waking from the procedure, has already been archived. My former colleagues in Processing Tower 7 have forgotten my name, if they ever knew it. My designation has been reassigned. The girl who sits at my old desk does not know I existed. No one knows, no one cares. The Imperium ground forward the moment I descended, unconcerned with my absence because I was designed from birth to be absentable, to leave no void when I was removed. But I know. That is the final cruelty. I know I have been erased. I know I am trapped. I know I will spend what remains of my life, years, perhaps decades if my body proves durable, processing the files of others like me, cataloging the disappeared while being disappeared myself. I will see my own pattern repeated 300 times per shift, the orphans, the functionaries, the unremarkable, the ones who believed service was enough. I will log their fates. I will move to the next file. I will understand that their terror in those final moments was my terror, that their realization was my realization, that we are all the same person repeated across thousands of bodies, all chosen for the same reason. The proctor places a new slate on my desk. Priority assignment, he says. Recent intake, special processing. The file opens. I see a face I recognize, a colleague from Tower 7, a man whose name I remember because we once coordinated on a complex tithe discrepancy, his crime, failure to report a fellow worker's suspicious behavior, the suspicious behavior befriending me, speaking to me outside of work requirements, expressing concern when I received a requisition form. He was chosen because he noticed my absence. I log the file. I move to the next. The machine grinds forward. The machine is always grinding forward. We are the fuel, the forgotten ones, the ones who disappear into the spaces between numbers. And the worst truth, the one that I understand now in perfect clarity, is that this is necessary. The Imperium requires this, not because of cruelty, though it is cruel, but because a machine this vast cannot function with sentiment, cannot pause to consider the value of individual lives, cannot afford to measure worth beyond utility. To feed 1 billion worlds, to maintain 10,000 years of expansion, to hold back the darkness at the edges of reality, it must process us without mercy. It must choose us because no one will miss us. It must make us disappear because resources are finite and we are not valuable enough to preserve. I would be angry, but anger requires the ability to act, and that has been severed. I would be despairing, but despair requires hope to have fallen from, and I cannot remember what hope felt like. I exist in a state beyond emotion, observing my own horror with detached precision, cataloging my own fate in the same mechanical way I catalog the fates of others. The shift ends. The bell rings. I had forgotten about the bell, but it rings now, a single pure note that somehow carries through the dead air. The workers stand in unison, file toward the rest cells in perfect lines. I stand, I walk. My legs carry me without my instruction. In my cell, I lie on the cot and stare at the ceiling, and somewhere behind my eyes the thing that was once me continues to scream, but my body is already asleep, already cycling through the minimal rest required to function tomorrow. And tomorrow I will wake. I will return to my station. I will process 300 files. I will see my own story reflected in each one. I will understand that every person in every file believed themselves different, believed themselves somehow exempt, believed that their service mattered, and I will know that I believed the same thing. We were all wrong. We were chosen because no one would miss us, and no one does. The Imperium endures. We do not.